The millionaire's son had skin cancer. The diagnosis condemned him to a life in the shadows, forbidden from sun exposure. Depression consumed him in his dark room, and the father, a powerful man, watched helplessly. That's when a simple cleaning lady was hired. No one paid much attention to her until one day the father heard the sound of water coming from the backyard. He rushed there, heart pounding, and the scene he saw threw him into total panic. The cleaning lady was in the yard, under the strong sun, playing with his son in an inflatable pool. He ran, shouting, expecting the worst. But what he was about to discover would change everything. Arthur Sterling's empire was a fortress built on the bedrock of the financial markets. His vast fortune, amassed through shrewd investments in stocks and the volatile but lucrative world of Wall Street, afforded him any luxury, any whim. His assets spanned continents, converted into dollars, euros, and even gold secured in Swiss vaults. He was a man who understood profit, dividends, and the power of capital to shape the world to his will. However, all that power crumbled to dust at the threshold of his son's bedroom. The world of Arthur Sterling, the multi-millionaire, was the size of that gloomy room, a gilded cage where sunlight was a death sentence. Leo, his only son, a 10-year-old boy with skin as pale and translucent as porcelain, carried the same inheritance that had taken his mother, a rare and merciless form of skin cancer. The sun, the star that nurtured life, was a mortal enemy to Leo, a relentless hunter stalking him from outside windows, sealed with UV filters and permanently shrouded by blackout curtains. The mansion, a monument to his immense wealth, was in truth a mausoleum. The air was meticulously filtered. The silent hallways echoed with the absence of childish laughter, and the life within pulsed to a slow, fearful rhythm. Arthur, a widower who relived his grief with every worried glance at his son, existed in a state of constant alert, a silent panic that gnawed at his soul. His anxiety was managed and executed by Agnes, the head housekeeper, a woman of rigid posture and a clinical gaze. She followed medical orders with a surgical precision that bordered on cruelty. To Agnes, Leo was not a child. He was a fragile patient, a collection of symptoms and restrictions to be managed. And she managed him with a short leash, suffocating any glimmer of spontaneity that dared to sprout in that sterile environment. Leo spent his days in the half-light, his face pressed against the window pane, observing the vibrant world he could not be a part of. He saw other children running on the grass, feeling the warmth of the sun that was poison to him. A quiet depression had settled in his small heart, a sadness so deep that his blue eyes, once bright, now looked like two still pools of water. It was against this backdrop of shadows and silence that a new cleaner was hired. Her name was Lucy, and like a promise held within its syllables, she seemed to carry light with her, not the dangerous light of the sun, but the light of a genuine smile, of a gaze that saw a child, not an illness. From the very first day, her presence shifted the heavy atmosphere of the house. While Agnes saw fragility, Lucy saw a contained thirst for life, a pulsating desire to simply be a boy. Her energy was a stark contrast to the apathy that dominated the mansion. Where Agnes imposed rules, Lucy whispered possibilities. The housekeeper, with her daily reports and inflexible schedules, watched her with suspicion, like one might watch a subversive element, a threat to the meticulous control she exerted over Leo's life, and by extension Arthur's. But Lucy, with her broom and dust cloth, seemed to ignore the tension, moving through the house with a lightness that had long been absent. She didn't challenge orders directly, but her mere existence was an act of rebellion. On her first day, while cleaning Leo's room, she found the boy sitting on the floor, head down, refusing to touch the lunch Agnes had served. The housekeeper insisted in a cold, authoritative voice, listing the nutrients and the importance of maintaining his strength. Lucy just watched for a moment, her heart aching. Then, without a word, She knelt beside him and with her finger began to draw a smiley face in the mashed potatoes. Leo looked up, surprised. A fleeting glimmer of curiosity crossed his pale face. Agnes glared daggers at her, ready to reprimand her for undermining her authority and treating food like a toy. But before she could speak, Lucy looked at the boy and whispered in the sweetest voice in the world, "Even food is happier with a smile, don't you think?" And then, to everyone's astonishment, Leo picked up his fork and, for the first time in weeks, took a bite, breaking apart the potato smile but beginning to sketch a barely perceptible one on his own lips. Agnes didn't wait for the lunch tray to be cleared to march to Arthur's office. Her steps were firm, echoing the indignation she felt. To her, the mashed potato incident was not an act of tenderness, but a breach of protocol, an insubordination that undermined the structure of care she had spent years building. "Mr. Sterling," she began without preamble, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "The new employee, Lucy, is introducing elements of disorder into Leo's dietary routine. Playing with food is unhygienic and undermines the discipline we are trying to establish." Arthur, who was analyzing the performance charts of his hedge funds on a giant monitor, turned slowly. In his mind, the numbers and strategies for growing his already vast fortune were simple, logical. His son's life, however, was a complex equation for which no amount of capital in the world seemed to have a solution. He had heard Agnes's report, but the image that dominated his thoughts was of Leo's hesitant smile, an emotional dividend he hadn't received in years. "Let me assess the situation, Agnes. For now, just observe her." The housekeeper retreated, displeased but obedient. Arthur's order, however, was not one of indifference. He began to watch Lucy through the intricate system of security cameras that covered every inch of the mansion. He became a vigilante in his own home, a spectator to the drama unfolding in the silent corridors. He saw Lucy clean with quiet efficiency, but he noticed something more. She spoke to the objects, dusted the furniture as if she were caressing it, and hummed sweet old melodies under her breath. They were small cracks of light in the house's oppressive gloom. The real revolution, however, began on the third day. Arthur watched, intrigued, on his monitor as Lucy entered the playroom, a vast space filled with the most expensive toys, all gathering dust from disuse. She was carrying a large box. From inside, she pulled out a small camping tent, as blue as the midday sky. Leo, who had been following her with his eyes from the hallway, stopped at the door, wary. He was used to Agnes's rigid schedule. Reading time, puzzle time, rest time. A camping tent was not on the program. Lucy set up the structure with patient gestures, the synthetic fabric making a soft, exciting rustle. She didn't call him, didn't force him. She just opened the tent flap and placed 2 pillows inside. Then she took a small device from the box and turned it on. Suddenly, the dark ceiling of the playroom transformed. Thousands of tiny points of light appeared, imitating a perfectly clear, starry sky. There were constellations, shooting stars, and a crescent moon that seemed to pulse gently. Leo held his breath. It was more beautiful than any picture he had ever seen in a book. "The sky came to visit us," Lucy said, her voice low, almost a secret, and she held out her hand to him. In his office, Arthur zoomed in the camera. He saw his son's hesitation, the look that sought an approval that never came, and then a small step and another. He watched Leo crawl into the tent and lie down, his pale face bathed in the cool light of the projected stars. A low sound came through the camera's microphone, a sound Arthur almost didn't recognize, a laugh, faint but genuine. At that moment, Agnes entered the playroom, her face contorted into a mask of horror and fury. "What is the meaning of this? This farce, peddling false hope? It's cruel," she hissed. But before she could advance, Lucy stood in the entrance of the tent, shielding Leo's private sky with her own body. "He doesn't need less hope, Mrs. Agnes. He needs more," she replied, her voice firm but without a trace of aggression. The housekeeper, trembling with rage, turned on her heel and marched toward Arthur's office, each step a promise that this was not over. "She is destroying everything, everything," she muttered, unaware that the man she was about to complain to had tears in his eyes for the first time in a long time, witnessing the small galaxy that had just been born in his son's heart. The door to Arthur's office swung open with a force that betrayed Agnes's usually contained demeanor. "Mr. Sterling, this has crossed every line," she declared, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "That woman is selling you a dangerous illusion. What she calls hope is merely a prelude to an even greater disappointment. Leo cannot camp under the stars. He cannot and should not get used to fantasies the real world denies him. Our job is to protect him from pain, not create scenarios that will make him suffer even more when reality sets in." Arthur remained silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled on the polished mahogany desk. He glanced at the blinking charts on the screen, at the numbers that represented his vast net worth, a mountain of money that could buy companies, islands, but could not buy the joy he had seen on his son's face. Agnes's argument was logical. It was the same argument he had used on himself for years, the same logic that had turned his home into a bunker, but the image of Leo's laugh, prompted by plastic stars, was an irrational, powerful force that shook the foundations of his conviction. "Agnes," he said finally, his voice more tired than authoritative, "I understand your concern. It is the same as my own. But I also saw something I haven't seen in a very long time. For now, the tent stays. Continue with your work, and I will continue to observe." The response was a dismissal cloaked in permission. Agnes left the office feeling the ground give way beneath her feet. The control she had so zealously maintained was beginning to crack. In the days that followed, the house existed under a veiled tension. Agnes redoubled her surveillance, noting every one of Lucy's small deviations in her notebook, building a silent dossier. Lucy, for her part, seemed oblivious to the hostility. She continued her quiet revolution, one step at a time. One morning, as Arthur monitored his stock prices on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, the camera in the living room caught his attention. Lucy had spread a picnic blanket, a vibrant red and white check, over the Persian rug. On the blanket sat a wicker basket. Leo was seated, cross-legged, his eyes wide with anticipation. Lucy took out sandwiches cut into star shapes, a thermos of strawberry juice, and chopped fruit in colorful containers. To complete the scene, she turned on a small speaker from which came the soft sound of birdsong and the distant buzz of insects. Leo closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "It smells like a park," he whispered, amazed. That's the smell of imaginary grass," Lucy replied, winking at him. They ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the fabricated nature, lost in that small oasis created in the heart of the mansion. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He thought of his deals, his financial instruments, the constant cash flow that guaranteed him a place among the world's richest men. And yet, the real wealth was right there, in that simple scene. A picnic on the carpet, set to the sound of recorded birds, was worth more than all the gold in his vaults. Leo's joy was a dividend that no cryptocurrency could ever pay. Later that day, Agnes cornered Lucy in the service hallway. "Do you think I don't know what you're doing?" she said, her voice low and menacing. "You're giving him candy only to snatch it away later. You're being irresponsible. His health is fragile, and your interference could have grave consequences." Lucy met Agnes's hard stare with a calm that disarmed her. "I'm not giving him what he can't have. I'm giving him what he already has. Imagination, joy, the right to be a child. The illness attacks his body. We can't let fear attack his soul." Agnes was left speechless. with only her impotent rage. That night, inside the tent under the starry sky, Leo asked Lucy a question. "Lucy, what does rain smell like?" Lucy smiled, an idea sprouting in her mind, dangerous and wonderful. "It smells like wet earth and clean air. It's one of the best smells in the world." She paused, looking at the boy's pale, curious face. "Leo, have you ever felt raindrops on your skin?" The question hung in the darkness, heavy with impossible desire, a promise of a world that existed only a few feet away, beyond those glass walls. Leo's question about the rain echoed in Lucy's mind all night. How could you describe such a primal sensation to someone who had never lived it? How do you explain the touch of 1,000 cool, soft needles on the skin, the sound of a steady drumming that washes the world clean, and the smell of awakened earth? It couldn't be explained. It had to be felt. The next morning, while cleaning the master suite, a colossal bathroom sheathed in floor-to-ceiling marble, a bold and transgressive idea took shape. The bathroom had a central floor drain designed for a millionaire's extravagances, like a waterfall showerhead that Arthur never used. It was the perfect place. The risk was enormous. Agnes watched her like a hawk, and humidity was one of the enemies listed in Leo's medical binder. But the image of the boy's expectant face under the starry sky gave her the courage she needed. The well-being of Leo's soul was a kind of return on investment that couldn't be measured in charts, but in smiles. She waited for the time when Agnes usually made her daily call to the pharmacy, a 20-minute ritual of Germanic precision. With her heart pounding, she went to get Leo. "We're going on an expedition," she whispered. "We're going to hunt for rain." Curiosity won out over the boy's usual apathy. He followed her, his bare feet padding across the cool marble of the bathroom. Lucy locked the door, an act of rebellion that sealed her fate in that house. She had brought a large garden watering can, one she'd found forgotten in the greenhouse, and filled it with warm water. "Take off your shirt, Leo," she said softly. He hesitated. The act of exposing his fragile skin was something he'd been taught to fear, but he trusted Lucy. Slowly, he slipped off his pajama top. Lucy picked up the watering can and raised it high. "Close your eyes and lift up your face." He obeyed, and then it rained. Gentle streams of warm water began to fall on his face, his chest, his arms. It wasn't a cold, wild rain, but a tame, controlled one, tailor-made for him. Leo gasped, a sound of pure astonishment. He opened his mouth, trying to taste the drops, just as he'd seen kids do in movies. The water trickled down his body, tickling him, washing away invisible fears. He opened his eyes and laughed, a loud, crystalline laugh that filled the cavernous space of the bathroom and ricocheted off the marble walls. It was the sound of pure life, a melody worth more than all the assets Arthur possessed. He spun slowly under his private reign, arms outstretched, his face transfigured by ecstatic joy. In his office, Arthur nearly spilled his coffee on his keyboard. The sound of his son's laughter, amplified by the audio system, was so unexpected he thought it was interference. He switched to the master bathroom camera, and the scene he saw made him hold his breath. However, Agnes's call to the pharmacy was shorter than usual. Finding Leo's room empty, a cold panic seized her. She followed the sound of laughter, a sound she barely recognized, to the locked bathroom door. "Open this door! Open it immediately!" she screamed, her voice shrill with alarm. Her pounding on the door was frantic. Inside, Leo's laughter stopped, the spell broken. Lucy, pale, turned off the rain. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. From the other side of the door, Agnes's voice was a judgment. "You don't know what you've done. He could get pneumonia. This is an assault. I'm calling Dr. Bennett right now and reporting your criminal negligence. You will be held responsible for this." The threat hung in the air, icy and final. Lucy looked at the frightened boy, dripping in the middle of the marble floor. and realized her small revolution of love and imagination might be about to end in the worst possible way. Agnes's knuckles hammered against the solid wood of the door, each knock a grenade of panic. "Open it! For God's sake! Open this door, you irresponsible woman!" Her voice, normally an instrument of cold control, was now frayed with hysteria. Inside, Leo's magical world had collapsed. The rain had stopped, but the boy was trembling, not from cold, but from the fear radiating from the door. Lucy quickly wrapped him in a fluffy towel, her own heart hammering in unison with Agnes's pounding. In his sanctuary of stocks and trades, Arthur felt his son's laughter being swallowed by a vacuum of panic. He stood up, his body moving before his mind could fully process the decision. He crossed the silent hallways, the sound of his expensive loafers on the marble, the only thing competing with the housekeeper's muffled shouts. Every step was a conflict. The billionaire's logic, which calculated risk and minimized liability, told him Lucy had been reckless, that she had endangered the fragile health of his most precious asset. But the memory of that laugh, an incalculable spiritual profit, was a stronger argument than any performance report. When he arrived, the scene was one of contained chaos. Agnes, her face red and splotchy, was pointing an accusatory finger at the door. She locked herself in there with him, with water, hypothermia, risk of pulmonary infection. The humidity is a catalyst for skin flare-ups. The list of medical calamities was recited like a litany, the same one that had imprisoned Arthur and his son for years. Just then, the door unlocked and Lucy appeared, holding the hand of Leo, who hid behind her legs, his face pale and scared. "Mr. Sterling," Agnes began, turning to him, certain of his support, "I demand that this woman be removed immediately. Her actions are a direct danger to Leo's life. This is more than negligence. It's—" Arthur held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes weren't on Lucy, nor on Agnes. They were fixed on his son, small and huddled. He saw the fear, the same fear he saw every day. But beneath it, he saw something else, the residual glow of a recent joy, like the warmth an ember leaves long after the flame is gone. His son's illness was a terrible inheritance from his late wife, a genetic burden no treasure could alleviate. But the fear, he realized in that instant, was an inheritance he himself was leaving him. He knelt, ignoring the creases in his expensive linen trousers, until he was at eye level with Leo. "Are you okay, champ?" Leo hesitated, glancing up at Lucy, then gave a timid nod. It was warm rain," he whispered, as if sharing a secret. Arthur felt his heart, a fortress of worries and fears, give way. He stood and faced the two women. His gaze on Agnes was as cold as steel. "Agnes, I appreciate your risk analysis. It was exhaustive." Then he turned to Lucy, who met his gaze with eyes full of quiet apprehension, ready to accept her sentence. "And you, Lucy, what do you have to say for yourself?" The question was calm, but it carried an immense weight. Lucy swallowed hard, her job and perhaps her future on the line. She looked at Arthur, not as a boss, but as a father. He was laughing. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low but firm. He was laughing so hard, I just wanted him to hear the sound of his own joy, without the noise of fear drowning it out. The simplicity of her answer disarmed the tension in the air. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Arthur looked at his housekeeper, then at the cleaner. His decision would define the future of this house, the future of his son. Finally, he spoke, his voice resonating with a final authority that left no room for argument. "Agnes, your concern has been noted. You may be excused for now." Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to Lucy, and a trace of something resembling a smile touched his lips. "Lucy, help Leo get dressed, and then bring the tent and the projector. We're camping in my office tonight." Arthur's decision hung in the air, dense and irrevocable. Agnes, For the first time in years of impeccable service, felt her world, built on the solid foundation of rules and protocols, tremble. Her face, a mask of professional indignation, hardened. She shot Lucy a look of pure contempt, a look that promised this battle, though lost, had not decided the war. Without a word, she turned and marched away, her retreat as rigid and controlled as her presence. Her silence was more menacing than any shout. Lucy felt a chill, but Leo's trembling smile, as he still clutched her hand, was enough to warm her. Arthur's invitation was more than a victory. It was a bridge being built across the chasm of fear that separated father and son. That night, Arthur's office, the epicenter of his vast business empire, transformed into a surreal campsite. The blue tent was pitched on a Persian rug that cost more than a car. The soft glow of the stars projected on the ceiling competed with the ghostly light of the monitors, which, even in sleep mode, displayed stock market graphs and cryptocurrency tickers like Bitcoin. Arthur sat on the floor, his back against his mahogany desk, feeling like a stranger in his own fortress. He, the man who negotiated fortunes in dollars and euros with a single phone call, felt awkward and powerless, sitting cross-legged on the ground. Leo, however, was radiant. Lying inside the tent, he gazed at the artificial sky with an almost religious reverence. Lucy sat near the entrance, a calm, reassuring presence. "Dad!" Leo called out, his small voice echoing in the office's silence. "Did Mom like the stars?" Arthur was caught off guard. It had been years since Leo had mentioned his mother. The pain of the loss was an emotional liability he had tried to bury under layers of work and worry. "Yeah, champ," he answered, his voice a little hoarse. She loved them. She used to say every star was a wish waiting to be found. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the hum of the computers. Arthur glanced at Lucy, who offered him a small, encouraging smile. In that moment, he understood that the real investment of his life wasn't in the blinking charts on the screens, but right here, on the floor of his office, under a plastic sky. His son's joy, the peace he felt in that instant, was a kind of wealth no net worth could ever buy. Meanwhile, in her quarters, Agnes was not idle. She felt betrayed, humiliated. Her dedication, her rigor, all of it had been discarded in favor of a cleaner's whims. To her, Arthur's decision wasn't an act of love, but of madness, a dangerous breach of the contract of care he had entrusted to her. She saw herself as the guardian of the house's true treasure, Leo's life, and that life, in her opinion, was now under threat from a sentimental amateur. Her loyalty to Arthur's late wife, whose illness she had seen through to the very end, fueled her conviction. She could not allow history to repeat itself through negligence. With hands trembling with righteous anger, she picked up the phone. She knew she was crossing a line, breaking her employer's trust in an irreparable way. But in her mind, it was a necessary act, a lesser evil to prevent a catastrophe. She dialed the private number of Dr. Bennett, Leo's oncologist, the one man whose authority Arthur would never dare to challenge. Back at the office campsite, Leo had finally fallen asleep, a serene smile on his lips. Arthur felt a wave of gratitude for Lucy, so overwhelming it left him speechless. He was about to try and verbalize what he felt when his personal cell phone, reserved only for the most urgent calls, vibrated on the desk. The name on the screen made his blood run cold. Dr. Bennett. Fear, the old familiar monster, awoke instantly, its cold claws clenching his stomach. He answered, his hand shaking slightly. "Arthur, I apologize for the hour," said the doctor's grave voice on the other end of the line. "I need to speak with you about Leo. Agnes just contacted me with some very alarming information." Dr. Bennett's voice was a blade of ice in Arthur's ear, shattering the fragile peace of the office campsite. Arthur, Agnes is extremely concerned. She's talking about high-risk activities, exposure to humidity, a breakdown of essential protocols. You know as well as I do that Leo's immune system is a precious and volatile asset. We can't afford any kind of liability in his treatment. Every word from the doctor was another brick in the wall Arthur had built around his son. He listened in silence, the weight of years of fear settling back onto his shoulders. The medical logic was irrefutable, the same logic that had dictated his life since the diagnosis. He thanked the doctor, assured him the situation was under control, and hung up. His heart as heavy as lead, the magic of the night was broken. In the following days, doubt settled in like a cold fog. Arthur watched Lucy with a divided gaze. His paternal instinct, trained to see danger in every shadow, was at war with the undeniable evidence of his son's happiness. It was on a particularly oppressive afternoon that the turning point came, not as a calculated decision, but as a tidal wave. Arthur was in his office, trying to focus on a report about the profitability of a new clean tech investment fund, but the numbers danced before his eyes without making sense. His real capital was in the next room, silent and dim. Suddenly, a sound cut through the mansion's silence. A sound that did not belong in that sterile environment. A splash of water, followed by a sharp, free laugh. It was coming from the backyard, a heavily wooded area that was, by express medical order, strictly forbidden to Leo. Panic exploded in Arthur's chest, instant and overwhelming. The report flew off the desk. The sun, the grass, the reflection in the water. His mind projected a catastrophe in seconds. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs, expecting to find his worst nightmare made real. The scene he found stopped him in his tracks. Under the deep, protective shade of a century-old oak tree, whose branches formed a natural canopy almost impenetrable to light, was a small, inflatable pool, and in it, his son, his porcelain-skinned boy, was shirtless, laughing his head off as he splashed water into the air with cupped hands. The sunlight, filtered and dappled by the leaves, touched the grass yards away, but the area around the pool was a sanctuary of shade. Lucy was sitting on the edge, watchful, slathering a fresh, thick layer of something white on the boy's shoulders. Sunscreen, maximum SPF. Arthur's panic dissolved, replaced by a wave of emotion so strong it took his breath away. He saw his son's skin, pale, yes, but vibrant, and he saw, for the first time in years, pure, raw, unfiltered happiness on Leo's face, a happiness that no money, no fortune could ever buy. At that exact moment, Agnes appeared, drawn by the same sound. What was an epiphany for Arthur was sacrilege for her, her face twisted into a mask of horror. "This is an assault! She is killing him!" she shrieked, her voice tearing through the quiet afternoon. She marched toward Arthur, her finger pointed at Lucy. "Mr. Sterling, your indecisiveness is endangering your son's life. I will not be complicit in this madness. It's her, or it's me." The ultimatum hung in the air, final and absolute. The choice was clear: fear or life, the prison or the possibility. Arthur's decision was immediate. Forged in that instant, he saw his son's laughter. He looked at Agnes, his voice calm, but with the firmness of steel. "Agnes, your dedication has been invaluable, but your time in this house has ended. Please pack your things." Agnes's departure was as silent and methodical as her presence had been. In less than an hour, her bags were by the door, and her key was placed on the foyer table. There was no scene, no final plea, just one last look at Arthur. A look that held a prophecy of disaster, before she disappeared through the front door, leaving behind a vacuum that was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in years, Arthur was solely in command. The housekeeper had left behind Leo's medical binders, meticulously organized, a testament to her efficiency. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk, the same one where he managed a multi-billion-dollar fortune, and felt like a complete amateur. The spreadsheets detailing the compound interest on his investments were childishly simple compared to the medication schedules, dietary restrictions, and toxicity reports of the treatments. The newfound freedom came with a crushing weight, the weight of total responsibility. He spent the afternoon trying to decipher this new kind of cash flow, the flow of his son's life. Every medical term was a hieroglyph, every instruction a potential minefield. The fear, which he thought he had banished along with Agnes, began to creep back in, subtle and poisonous. What would he do if Leo ran a fever? What if a new spot appeared? Who would he call? Who could he trust? His vast fortune seemed useless, a pile of colored paper in the face of his son's fragility. It was Lucy who found him like that, lost in a sea of paperwork, his face pale and tense. She said nothing, just placed a steaming cup of tea beside him. "You look like a man who has just inherited a kingdom he doesn't know how to rule," she said softly. Arthur let out a sigh, a mix of exhaustion and despair. "That's exactly how I feel, Lucy. I'm an expert at building an empire of money, but I'm a novice in the kingdom of my own son." She pulled up a chair and sat across from him, a gesture of bold familiarity. "You don't need to rule, Mr. Sterling. You need to participate. Leo doesn't need a crisis manager. He needs a father." Her words, simple and direct, hit him with the force of a revelation. He had spent years managing the illness, delegating the care, overseeing the project of keeping his son alive. But when was the last time he had simply participated in his life? The scene by the pool flashed in his mind. That wasn't management. It was participation. It was life. Inspired, he pushed the papers aside and went with Lucy to Leo's room. They found him drawing. It was the oak tree from the yard, and underneath it, 3 smiling stick figures inside a blue blob. The joy of that afternoon still shone in his eyes. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time without the filter of constant worry, just talked with his son. They talked about stars, about the feel of water, about the color of the leaves. It was a normal, almost banal conversation, and for that very reason, the most extraordinary thing in the world. That night, a new routine began to form. Arthur insisted on giving Leo his medication himself, his large hands, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, trembling slightly as he counted out the pills. Lucy stood by his side, not as a supervisor, but as a silent support. After Leo fell asleep, exhausted and happy, Arthur walked Lucy to the kitchen door. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling insufficient for the gratitude he felt. She just smiled. "Good night, Mr. Sterling." When he returned to Leo's room for one last check, the boy stirred in his sleep, his arm shifting out from under the blanket. The soft light from the nightstand fell on the pale skin, revealing something that made Arthur's heart stop. Near the elbow, there was a small, reddish, slightly raised mark that hadn't been there that morning. His mind raced. Was it an allergic reaction? An insect bite? Or was it the beginning of something more? Agnes's voice echoed in his head, cold and victorious. "She is killing him." Panic, the monster he had kept at bay all day, returned with overwhelming force. Its claws digging into his chest, suffocating him. The air rushed out of his lungs. That tiny red mark, insignificant to any other parent, was a full stop to Arthur, a sign of total collapse in his most crucial investment, his son's life. All his stocks, his entire net worth, seemed like a bad joke at that moment. His mind, trained to analyze data and predict market trends, went into absolute panic mode. The worst-case scenario was no longer a probability to be managed. It was a certainty unfolding. Agnes's words were a deafening echo. Criminal negligence. She is killing him. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Dr. Bennett's contact. It would be a return to the old order, an admission of defeat, proof that joy was too expensive a luxury, too volatile an asset for his son. He was a multi-millionaire who controlled an empire, but the truth was, he controlled nothing. He was one phone call away from diving back into the safe, familiar darkness of fear. But he hesitated. The image of Leo laughing in the pool, the image of his serene face sleeping under plastic stars, fought against the panic. Desperate, not knowing what else to do, he left the room and walked, almost ran, down the dark hallways toward the staff wing. He found Lucy in the small kitchen, making herself a cup of tea before turning in. Her presence was so calm it seemed to absorb some of his agitation. "Lucy," he said, his voice a thread. "Something's happened." On Leo's arm, a mark. He expected her to panic, to validate his terror, but she just set down the teapot, her face showing serene concern, not alarm. "Show me," she said simply. They returned to Leo's room, moving like shadows. Arthur pointed to the mark, his hand trembling. Lucy leaned in, her eyes examining the small spot in the dim light. She didn't touch it, not wanting to wake the boy. "Did you notice it before the pool?" she asked, her voice low and calm. Arthur thought, no. He was obsessed with his son's skin. He would have noticed. "No," he admitted. And when he got out of the water, was he shivering from cold or from excitement? She continued. "From excitement," Arthur replied, remembering the boy's vibrant energy. "He didn't cough, didn't sneeze." "No, nothing." Lucy straightened up and looked at Arthur. "Mr. Sterling, I understand your fear. It's the fear of a father who loves more than anything. But panic is the worst advisor. This looks like an irritation, a scrape. He was playing, moving his body in a way he hasn't in a long time. The edge of the pool, a toy, even just rubbing against the grass. His skin is sensitive. But it's not made of glass." Her words were a balm on his burning mind. Logic, but a different kind of logic from Agnes's. A logic based on life, not on sickness. At that moment, Leo murmured something in his sleep and turned over. "I won the race," he mumbled, a smile ghosting his lips. Arthur and Lucy exchanged a look. The race had been a game Leo had made up, sliding on his stomach along the inflatable edge of the pool, the elbow. It was the exact spot where he had braced himself. The explanation was so simple, so mundane, it seemed almost impossible. Arthur felt his legs go weak with relief. "Let's make a pact," Lucy whispered. "We watch it. If it's the same or better in the morning, it was just a play mark. If it's worse, we call Dr. Bennett. What do you say?" Arthur could only nod, unable to speak. She gave him a small nod and left silently. Arthur remained alone in the room, watching his son sleep. The monster of panic had retreated to its cage, but in its place, a new and unsettling emotion began to take shape. He realized that in his moment of greatest terror, his first instinct hadn't been to call the doctor, but to find her. Her calm was the only thing that had stood between him and the abyss, and that dependence, that need for her strength, scared him almost as much as the disease itself. The night was a long vigil. Arthur barely slept. His dreams filled with market charts that morphed into erratic electrocardiograms. Before the first grey light of dawn pierced the curtains, he was already up, his heart beating a funereal march against his ribs. He tiptoed into Leo's room, holding his breath. With a gentleness that belied his anxiety, he lifted the sleeve of his son's pajamas. His eyes scanned the pale arm, and for a moment, he saw nothing. His brain, primed for catastrophe, refused to process the absence of the mark, but it was there, or rather it wasn't. In place of the red, inflamed spot from the night before, there was only Leo's smooth, unblemished skin, with a discoloration so faint it was almost imaginary. A wave of relief, so powerful it made him dizzy, washed over him. The monster of panic wasn't dead, but it had been beaten. For now, He felt a pang of shame for his reaction, but beneath it, a seed of something new, trust in Lucy's intuition, an intuition that was worth more than any risk analyst's report. Later, in the kitchen, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Arthur poured himself a coffee, his hands steady again. Lucy was preparing Leo's breakfast, moving with her usual quiet efficiency. "It's gone," he said, his voice low. "The mark, you were right." Lucy turned, a small smile playing on her lips. Kids with scraped knees, parents with scared hearts. It's the oldest combination in the world, Mr. Sterling. Arthur felt a sudden urge to compensate her, to translate his gratitude into the only language he completely mastered. "Lucy, I want to give you a bonus, a substantial raise. Your care is an invaluable asset to this house." He expected her to be happy, perhaps even flattered. Instead, she looked at him with a gentleness that disarmed him. "Leo's smile and your peace of mind are the only bonus I need, sir. The rest is just my job." The gentle refusal was more impactful than any reprimand. It showed him that there were riches his vast fortune couldn't touch, a kind of profit that couldn't be deposited in a bank. That day marked another subtle shift. Lucy, sensing Leo's need to connect with life, brought nature inside in a new way. She appeared in the playroom with large wooden window boxes, bags of soil, and packets of seeds. "We're going to plant a window garden," she announced to Leo. The boy, who only knew Earth from books, looked at the bags with a mix of fear and fascination. Arthur watched from a distance, leaning against the doorframe. He saw his son plunge his hands into the soil for the first time, his expression of surprise at the cool, damp texture. He saw the concentration on his face as he and Lucy planted seeds for basil, cherry tomatoes, and colorful flowers. They laughed, got dirty, and in that moment, the sterile playroom, full of expensive, lifeless possessions, was transformed into a place of creation, of hope. Arthur, the billionaire who owned land on 3 continents, realized he had never truly owned a piece of earth. That small window garden held more life and promise than all his vast properties. As he watched Lucy wipe a smudge of dirt from Leo's cheek, laughing, an image superimposed itself on the scene. A flashback, sharp and painful, his late wife, Sophia, in the garden of their first house, doing the exact same thing to a much younger Arthur after a botched attempt at planting roses. The same gentle touch, the same laugh that seemed to light up the world. The memory hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. He backed away from the door, his breath caught in his throat. The feeling growing in his chest for Lucy wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't admiration. It was something deeper, more dangerous, something he thought he had buried forever with Sophia. It was the unmistakable echo of love beginning, and that realization terrified him more than any spot on his son's skin. The terror of that revelation was a solvent that dissolved the camaraderie blooming between Arthur and Lucy, leaving behind a residue of awkward formality. Arthur, a master of compartmentalization in his business dealings, applied the same strategy to his heart. The emotion he felt for Lucy was a high-risk asset, an investment with a potential for catastrophic loss that he was unwilling to underwrite. The ghost of Sophia, of his pain and his loss, was too great a liability on his emotional balance sheet. His defense was to retreat into the safety of his ivory tower, to the role of employer. Mr. Sterling returned with full force, and easy conversations were replaced by brief, impersonal instructions. He began to avoid the moments they had previously shared, like the nightly campouts, citing late business calls with Asian time zones, or the need to analyze the crypto market before the Tokyo Stock Exchange opened. He buried himself in work, using his vast fortune as a shield against vulnerability. Lucy felt the change as if a door had been slammed in her face. The warmth and trust they had built together evaporated, leaving an inexplicable chill. She replayed every conversation, every gesture, searching for a misstep, a wrong word that might have caused his retreat, but she found nothing. Her concern wasn't for herself, but for Leo. The boy, who had been flourishing under the new family dynamic, might wither in this sudden frost. She saw Arthur watching their games from a distance. His eyes filled with a melancholy she couldn't understand, like a man staring at a feast through a window, starving but unable to enter. Her intuition told her the problem wasn't her, but something inside him, an old pain that her actions had inadvertently awakened. She decided to give him space, continuing her work with Leo with the same dedication, hoping the boy's joy would be a beacon bright enough to guide his father back. The opportunity for confrontation or for healing came from the most unexpected place: the soil. One morning, 2 weeks after the pool incident, Leo ran down the hall, his eyes shining with the excitement of an explorer discovering a new world. "Dad, Lucy, come see. They were born." He grabbed both adults by the hand and pulled them, impatient, toward the playroom. In the wooden boxes that served as their window garden, tiny specks of vibrant green had broken through the dark surface of the soil. They were minuscule, fragile, but undeniably alive. They were the promise of tomatoes, of basil, of flowers. They were proof that life, even in the gloom of that house, always found a way. Leo pointed to each tiny sprout with paternal pride. "This one's going to be a giant tomato, and this one will smell like pizza." His joy was so contagious that, for a moment, the barrier between Arthur and Lucy seemed to dissolve. They stood there, side by side, looking at the small life they had helped create, a joint venture that involved no money or capital, only soil, seeds, and hope. Arthur looked at Lucy's face, illuminated by Leo's happiness, and felt his heart skip a beat. Her resemblance to the memory of Sophia in the garden wasn't just physical, it was the same aura of nurturing, the same ability to cultivate life around her. In that instant, Leo, at the peak of his happiness, turned to them, his face beaming. He looked at his father, then at Lucy, and then at the tiny green sprouts, as if connecting the dots of a perfect universe. With the pure, disarming logic of a child, he smiled and asked the question that would shatter all of Arthur's defenses. "We're a garden family, aren't we?" The innocent question landed in the silent room with the weight of an anvil, shattering the glass of formality Arthur had constructed. It was the exact phrasing of his greatest wish and his deepest fear. Leo's question, "We're a garden family, aren't we?" was the key that broke open the vault where Arthur kept his deepest emotions. The sound of the lock snapping was deafening in the silence of his heart. Suddenly, his entire net worth, his stocks, his empire of money and business seemed childish, a collection of useless toys before the magnitude of that moment. Here, among the green sprouts and the smell of damp earth, was the real treasure, the only investment that truly mattered. And he was about to bankrupt it with his own cowardice. His first instinct was to retreat, to mutter an excuse, and flee to the safety of his office, to the cold logic of numbers that would never ask him if they were a family. But Leo's eyes were fixed on his, full of a hope so pure and unconditional that to run would be the cruelest act of his life. And Lucy's eyes were on him, not with expectation, but with a profound understanding, as if she could see the war raging inside him. He felt the ghost of Sophia beside him, not as a censure, but as a sad memory of what was lost. His love for her had been the greatest profit of his life, and her loss, the most devastating liability, a debt he thought he would spend the rest of his life repaying. The fear of loving again, of exposing himself to that pain once more, was the compound interest on that debt, growing every day, choking off any possibility of future happiness. He looked at the green sprouts, so fragile, yet fighting for the light with a quiet tenacity, and he understood. He was doing to his own heart what he had done to his son, locking it in darkness for fear of the light. The overprotection, the fear that guided him, was weakening not only his son's body and soul, but also his own. Lucy hadn't just brought sunshine into Leo's life, she had brought the possibility of a new season into his. The decision was made. The risk was total. The potential for loss immense, but the return on a life fully lived was a prize worth betting everything on. He knelt, positioning himself between Lucy and Leo at his son's eye level. His hand, which had signed deals that moved fortunes in euros and dollars, trembled as he placed it on Leo's small shoulder. "Yes, champ," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't bother to hide. "It's what I want us to be more than anything." Leo broke into a smile that could have lit up the entire house. Then Arthur turned to Lucy. His mask of the impenetrable billionaire dissolved completely, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. "Lucy," he began, his voice low and heavy with raw honesty. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the distance, for being so cold. I was afraid." He paused, his eyes searching hers, pleading for understanding. "I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of this." He gestured helplessly at the air between them, at the domestic scene, at the fragile happiness sprouting like the seeds on the windowsill. "I was afraid of this." Hope. The confession hung between them, an offering of peace, a plea of surrender. He had exposed his greatest fear, his greatest weakness. His entire emotional empire was now in her hands. The future of this garden family depended not on his money or his power, but on the answer of a woman he had, until recently, seen as just a cleaner. The silence that followed Arthur's confession was the silence of a vault being opened. Lucy neither flinched nor shied away from his vulnerability. Instead, her eyes, which had so often reflected only professional compassion, filled with a deep, personal tenderness. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. Her hand found Arthur's, which was still resting on Leo's shoulder, and her touch was gentle yet firm. "A family isn't born from forgetting, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a balm on the wound he had just exposed. "It's born from the courage to plant a new garden, even when you know winters exist. Your grief for Sophia doesn't diminish what can grow here. On the contrary, it's the fertile soil that made you capable of such a protective love." She paused, and when she spoke again, the formality was gone forever. "Yes, Arthur, let's be a garden family." Her acceptance wasn't just an answer to a question. It was an acknowledgement of his entire journey, his pain and his fear. For Arthur, those words were the final absolution. He felt tears he had suppressed for years well up in his eyes, not of sadness, but of a cathartic release. The emotional debt he felt he owed to his wife's memory, a liability that had haunted every decision, was finally paid in full. At that moment, Leo, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, did what children do best. He turned emotion into action. He threw his arms out and wrapped them around his father's neck and Lucy's waist in a tight, awkward hug, uniting them. And there, on the floor of the playroom, surrounded by soil and green promises, the three of them became a unit, a small ecosystem of love and healing. The mansion, once a mausoleum, began to breathe again. The weeks that followed were a metamorphosis. The blackout curtains, once sentinels of darkness, were now drawn back in the late afternoon to let in the soft, fading light. The sound of Leo's laughter became the new soundtrack of the hallways, a melody worth more than any gold in a vault. Their routine was no longer dictated by a medical binder, but by the rhythm of life. They baked together, Leo's hands covered in flour. They read stories in the tent, now a permanent installation in the living room, and they tended to their window garden, which grew lush and vibrant, a living metaphor for their own transformation. Arthur discovered that the true management of his portfolio wasn't in diversifying funds or tracking Bitcoin, but in managing his time to maximize moments with his son and the woman he loved. The attraction, born from admiration for her courage, had blossomed into a deep and serene love. He found in Lucy not just Leo's savior, but the woman who had taught him not to be afraid of the sun, or of loving again. One evening, as they watched Leo sleep, his face peaceful, Lucy rested her head on Arthur's shoulder. "Your highest interest doesn't come from any bank," she whispered. "It comes from his smile." Arthur squeezed her hand, his heart overflowing. The billionaire who had amassed a fortune to secure his son's future, finally realized what true inheritance he wanted to leave. It wasn't assets, or stocks, or dollars. It was the indelible memory of a home filled with light, laughter, and love. It was the certainty that even after the longest night, the sun can and will rise again. 6 months later, the morning sun was no longer an enemy to be barred, but a welcome visitor, filtered softly through light curtains that danced in the breeze. The mansion, once a golden tomb, was now a vibrant home, its silence filled by the sound of Leo running through the halls. The boy, months into remission, had color in his cheeks, his pale skin now kissed by brief, carefully supervised morning sunbaths. His energy was living proof that the soul, when healed, has the power to strengthen the body. Arthur's empire remained vast, his net worth growing with the whims of the stock market, but his world was no longer the size of a dark room. His world was now the size of a 3-person hug, a picnic in the yard, a shared sunrise. His greatest wealth was no longer secured in vaults or diversified in financial assets. It was right there, laughing in the living room. The climax of his journey had not been a single, thunderous event, but a new and wonderful routine, where fear had been replaced by prudence, and panic by love. On an autumn afternoon, as Arthur and Lucy sipped coffee on the porch, watching the leaves fall, Leo approached them. He had the solemn look of someone bearing an important gift. In silence, he handed a piece of paper to Arthur. It was a drawing, made with the firm, confident hand his new life had given him. In it, 3 stick figures, disproportionate but unmistakable, held hands under an immense, smiling sun. The boy in the middle, slightly smaller, had blonde hair. Beside him were a taller man and a woman with long brown hair. Arthur felt his throat tighten. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a testament. It was their story, the only inheritance that mattered, summarized in crayon. He remembered the scene that had sent him into a panic, the sight of Leo in the inflatable pool. That image, which at the time had seemed like the prelude to a tragedy, was in fact the end of a life in shadow and the beginning of an illuminated future. He turned to Lucy, the drawing held in his hands as if it were the most valuable contract he had ever signed. His attraction to her, born of admiration for her courage, had blossomed into a deep, calm, and unshakable love. She was not his son's savior. She was the woman who had saved them both. The woman who taught him that the greatest fortune in the world is having someone to share the light with. "Lucy," he began, his voice firm with the certainty only true love can provide, "I've spent my life building an empire for my son, accumulating assets and capital to give him security. But the truth is, the greatest asset I can leave him isn't my money. It's a home, it's a family. Will you help me build that?" Officially, he didn't offer her a diamond ring or the promise of a life of luxury. He offered her his heart, his vulnerability, and the promise of a shared future. The tears that welled in Lucy's eyes were of pure joy. Her yes was a whisper that sealed their fate. Months of anguish, fear,